Good morning, everyone. Sorry, they got some helpers up here. I'm just going to name the elephant in the room. I don't know how you spent your Christmas break, but I spent the last week getting over the flu, and now I have a sinus infection. So I sound a little hoarse, and I got some cough drops and some water, but we'll get through it, okay? So I'm all right. Don't worry. And I'm not contagious anymore. So you're all fine. We're good. But if I do reach for water or a cough drop, now we all know why, okay? And welcome to those watching us online. If you're watching us online or on the app, go ahead and fill out our digital Connect card and let us know that you're here and how we can be praying for you. So, okay, when I was learning how to drive, I grew up in a really small town in New Hampshire. So small that we didn't get our own zip code till I was in high school because they brought 911 in and they finally had to give us our own zip code. Half the town growing up had one other town zip code and another town zip code. We don't have a stoplight. We don't have a post office, like none of that stuff in my hometown. So small hometown in New Hampshire. And so, most of the roads that I drove on weren't very busy. And when I was learning how to drive, my dad finally took me on like the main road, okay? Not like a highway with like on-ramps and off-ramps, just a two-way lane that went about 45 miles an hour. And it was my first time on that road, and 45 felt really, really fast for a 15-and-a-half-year-old. Many of us don't remember that because now we think if someone's going 45, we're like, what is your problem, right? So I'm driving 45, and I'm like, barely driving 45, hanging on, and suddenly there's a car behind me, and they are not pleased that I'm driving the speed limit, right? And they're like coming right up against my bumper, and I'm just, this little kid looking out my rear view mirror, and they're like creeping up, and I can see that they're agitated, and it makes me, I start to get worried, and I start to be like, do I need to drive faster? And my dad is sitting next to me, and he gives me some of the best advice he's ever given me in my life, and he goes, Meredith, when you are behind the wheel of your car, you drive your car. You don't let anyone else drive your car, right? And so good driving advice, right? When you're behind the wheel, you drive your car. Good advice for driving, good advice for living, right? Don't let someone else drive your life just because they're coming up in your rearview mirror, pushing you to go faster or want better things for you or different expectations that you have. But very often we let other people, outside pressures, outside expectations, start to drive the pace of our life. And when we do that, we start saying yes to the wrong things. And when we say yes to the wrong things, we often miss the good things that God has for us. We miss the best things. We say no to the best things sometimes. And there's one interaction that Jesus has that really brings us to light. And if you're new, I always put the scripture up on the screen, but if you want to follow along, it's in Luke chapter 10, starting at verse 38. And this is how our story starts. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. And so Jesus and his disciples, they're travelers. They're this traveling band. He's this traveling teacher, and they don't have a home base at whatever town this is. They don't have a place to go. Jesus relied on people to open their homes and provide hospitality. So that's what Martha does. She opens her home, and this is a very good thing. This would have blessed Jesus and his disciples. And hospitality is a big deal in this culture. To be someone who is welcoming, to welcome the stranger is a big deal. All right, and then our story continues. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. And so with hosting, there were all these cultural expectations where you provided a meal. You had to make your guests feel welcome. You were expected to serve. And so Martha's doing all the things that she's supposed to be doing. And this would be what women did, okay? This was women's work at this time. So women, they do all the preparation. And Martha ends up doing all the work by herself. And her sister Mary's just sitting around, hanging out in the room. And Martha's getting ticked. Right? Martha's pretty upset to the point where she comes to Jesus and confronts him and is like, hey, don't you care that Mary's just sitting around? Like, tell her to come and help me. Tell her to get in here. And the word that Luke uses to describe Martha's state is very telling. That word distracted in the Greek, it means to be pulled away and dragged around. What a perfect explanation for obligation, right? When we are acting out of obligation, we feel pulled away no matter what. It's not due to our preferences. We feel pulled away and then we feel dragged around. Like we didn't have a choice in the matter, right? And so we can begin to understand how Martha feels. Some of you are like, yeah, Martha got the raw deal here. So she's acting out of obligation. And here's the thing about obligation. Martha, she's saying yes to the wrong things, but she's not saying yes to bad things, right? What Martha's doing isn't bad. Welcoming someone into her home, providing a meal, making sure that everyone feels welcomed and comfortable. These are not bad things, but the way in which she's going about them is not blessing her or anyone else around her. She's feeling pulled away and dragged around, and these external expectations are driving her life. Someone came up in her rearview mirror and said, you've got to have this type of meal and make your house feel this type of way and do these types of things, and she is just left pulled away, dragged around, acting out of obligation. She's in the realm of have to. I have to do this. I have to make everyone this meal. I have to make sure all these things are done, regardless of what she wants. And that's what obligation does to us, right? Regardless of your preferences, of what you want, you have to. You have to get it done a certain way. And there are 3 influences that I see that make us fall into obligation. And the first one of those is guilt. Guilt. And guilt is really about that we don't want to disappoint someone else, right? We don't want to be the cause of someone being distraught or upset or angry or disappointed. Like we don't want to do that. And so we feel like we have to do whatever it is people expect us to do. Show up at a certain place, say yes to a certain thing, whatever that is, because we can't bear the idea that someone might be upset with us. And so we say yes in order to keep people happy. Right? That's our first motivation, is guilt. The second influence to obligation is fear. And so while guilt is that I don't want anyone to be upset with me, fear is I don't want anyone to think badly about me. I'm worried about the assumptions that people might make. They might think I'm lazy or flaky or unreliable or whatever that is. They might write this story about me, and I can't control what that would be. And so I fear the judgment of others, which is ultimately I fear the rejection of others, right? I don't want to be rejected. And so we say yes to keep up appearances, right? So we say yes to guilt to keep people happy. We say yes to fear to keep up appearances. And the third influence is pride. And pride comes in when we start to assume, not only do I have to, I'm really the only one who can, right? Either no one else is willing or no one else is able. No one can do it as good as I can. Or no one in my family is going to know how to have a decent conversation. So I have to go to that dinner in order to be the one sane person at the dinner table. Whatever it is, you are the only one. You have to. You're the only one who's willing, the only one who's able. And when we get into pride, it's this overinflated view of ourselves. And so we start to think, I am so important. And this low view of other people where they couldn't possibly do what I could do. And so we say yes in order to keep everything from falling apart, right? Because if you weren't there, everything would fall apart. You are the one person who's going to make that work. And all these 3 things are a vicious cycle, right? Because you might start saying yes because of guilt, to keep people happy, but then you also want to keep up appearances and you want to keep everything from falling apart. Guilt, fear, and pride, they just kind of play into one another and they all get in the mix there. And when this happens, it leaves Martha feeling pulled away and dragged around. And I know I've been there before. I know some of you can relate to that too. So there was a number of years back when I was at a different church, I was overseeing a very large staff and I was over a number of departments and I had to overhaul a lot of them. They needed a lot of work. And so I just had this huge responsibility, this huge workload in my regular job. And then 2 opportunities came my way. One was to speak at a leadership conference, and another one was to join a leadership team for our denomination. And I was like, oh gosh, I don't have time for either of these. But those 3 influences totally got into my head. And, so there was guilt, these people, they know me, they chose me, they're telling me how perfect I'll be for these opportunities, and they really, they needed my help. They really wanted me to participate. And then fear, if I don't say yes, then they're going to think I'm flaky and I can't handle it, and they're never going to ask me again, and they're going to tell other people not to ask me to do things because she's just way overwhelmed. She can't handle anything extra. And then pride, in case you hadn't noticed, I'm a woman in ministry, right? And there's not a lot of us. And so, excuse me. Gonna grab my water for a second. And so I start feeling there's not gonna be any other women speaking at this leadership conference. And I am the only woman they're asking to join this leadership team. Like, I have to represent. Like, I have to be the person to like change the world just by showing up. And so all these three things influences, and I said yes to them, much to the dismay of my husband, who is, while I am a notorious overcommitter, he is definitely an undercommitter in most of the ways. And so he looks at me and he's like, this is not going to go well. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. Didn't work out so good. So the conference that I said yes to, it was a 3-hour drive away, and it was in the middle of a very busy season. Fall in ministry is busy. It's when like everything's gearing up, and I'm overseeing like our adult department, our kids department, our youth department. They're all starting everything, but I managed to write this talk that I had to do, and they had asked me if I would do 2 talks, right? And I thought I was really clear to tell them, no, I'm going to just do 1 talk. But instead, they thought I was going to do 2 talks. So I drove all the way there. I did my first talk, the only talk that I had prepared for that I thought I was doing. And then I left, right? And halfway through my drive home, my 3-hour drive home, they call me and they're like, hey, we're ready for your next talk. I'm like, I'm sorry. I'm not there. And I wasn't planning on that. I thought that we had communicated this way, but in my busyness, I didn't clarify, right? So like we got our wires crossed. And luckily they were able to handle it. They had someone step in, which was a great like check on my pride, right? Like I'm the only one who could do that. Nope, they had someone who could just pinch hit and step in and do that second talk, right? And when I got back, I was like, this is not good. Whatever is happening in my life, this is not good. And then this team started right at that same time. And this team was the worst. It was the worst team because here's the thing. They said they wanted a new and unique perspective, right? But they were like-minded with each other, but not with me, right? And so I came in and I started saying, well, maybe we could do it this way. And I realized very quickly, they want the appearance of someone who has a different thought. They don't actually want to do anything differently. And so, I mean, this team would take like an hour out of my day just for the meeting, and then the drive there and back. And the person who asked me, I loved dearly and I respected, but I came to learn like he was the worst meeting runner I've ever seen. It was just like there was no agenda. It was meandering. It was like, what are we even talking about? And so I'd leave this meeting hurried and rushed because I'd given all this time to something that didn't feel all that important. And it was eating up all the other time that I needed to use for other things. And so I had clearly said yes to the wrong things. It became so obvious I had said yes to the wrong things. And they weren't bad things. They just weren't the right things. And I was so rushed that I was choosing out of obligation. And it didn't bring out the best in me. And that's the thing. Obligation never does. It doesn't bring out the best in us, does it? Like, people don't appreciate us when we're acting out of obligation, when we're rushed and hurried. And Jesus makes this really clear to Martha. And so after Martha complains to Jesus, she's expecting him to be like, yeah, you're right. I see all the work that you're doing. You're working so hard. And your sister over here, she's a slacker. She needs to get in the kitchen and help you too. But instead, Jesus turns to her and he goes, Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things. And here's the thing in the Bible. If you see something repeated, like Abraham, Abraham, like especially when you see a double name, it is God being, it's like exclamation points, like 3 exclamation points in a row. It's God being like, pay attention. So when we see Martha, Martha, this is like, pay attention. Jesus is about to lay on some really important truth here. Martha, Martha. And so he reveals the state of her heart. And he says, you are worried and upset. And that word worried means to be anxious and troubled with cares. And upset means to be disturbed and troubled in mind. And so she has this troubled heart. He's showing her that she's been dragged around, pulled away, dragged around, and it's left her with this troubled heart. And she's given in to guilt, fear, and pride. And that leaves us with a troubled heart. And this is what a troubled heart looks like. It looks like a heart that is burdened, anxious, and resentful. So when we're burdened, and we're worried about disappointing others, we start to carry around all their feelings and worries and expectations and disappointments. Like we take them on ourselves and we're walking around with them all. No one asked us to, right? Maybe they did, but often they didn't. But we burden ourselves to make sure like no one else is upset or going to be disturbed in any way. And so life starts to feel really heavy when we do that, when we're carrying around the anticipation of someone else's disappointment. Life starts to feel heavy, and we start to feel weighed down, and we start to feel overwhelmed and overscheduled. And so we're just trying to fit in one other thing, right? I'll just fit this in too, so that way no one's upset, and I don't let anyone down, and no one's disappointed. And so we start to bend over backwards to try to make everyone happy. And then we get anxious. And here's the thing. When we are so worried about what other people think about us, when that's all that we're thinking about, like what story are they going to write about me? We cannot genuinely care for other people when we are too busy caring about what people think about us, right? You can't care for someone when you're too worried and you care too much about what they think about you. And so we start to write stories ahead of time when we're anxious, right? We start to assume we know what people are going to say. We fill in the blank for them. And often we assume that they're going to assume the worst about us. We assume that they have really bad intentions towards us, and so we're certain rejection is just around the corner. Any second now, someone's going to say this terrible thing about me, and people just basically become a mirror to us for our own sense of acceptance. Am I acceptable? Do you accept me? And so we become anxious, and then ultimately we become resentful. Because at first it feels good to be needed, right? It feels good to, like, people need me. I'm so important. I'm so essential. It's so great. But then after a while, you start to be like, and nobody seems to appreciate everything that I'm doing. And we start keeping score. And you realize, like, hey, I am going above and beyond and doing all the things that people need. And everyone else is just doing the bare minimum. Like, and no one appreciates how much I'm doing. And you start weighing what you do against other people, right? And you realize, like, oh, I always come up on top when I do that. I look so good when I do that. And everyone else looks like a slacker. Like, they don't look like they're pulling their weight at all. And so we start comparing, and we feel resentful. We feel burdened. We feel anxious. And this is the state of Martha's troubled heart that Jesus is revealing to her, that she's weighed down and she's troubled. And to be honest, this is where some of you are today, right? Some of us coming in here, like, I was flat out for Christmas break, but it's because I was on the couch the whole time. But some of you were flat out for Christmas break because you were pulled away and dragged around by everybody's expectations, right? You had to go to this extra party. You had to rush and get your child the best toy. Like, you had to stay up extra late to wrap everything, or you had to work those extra hours. Like, you had to. And so we're here we are. Tomorrow, many of you are headed back to work, right? And your kids are headed back to school this week, and you are already exhausted. It is January 2nd, and you are already like, man, this year is long. It's 2 days in, and we're only at 11 a.m. And you're like, I don't know, 2022. You're already tired, and you're anxious. And maybe you're already resentful because you're carrying over last year's resentment into this year. And, you thought this year would be different. Like, you hope that the turning of a calendar year would be the turning of a whole new life. But here's the thing, that stuff doesn't just happen on its own. That's not the way it works. Like, you don't just stop saying yes to the wrong things just because the year changed. Something else has to change in us. Peter Scazzero says this, but we can't stop. If we aren't busy, we feel guilty that we waste time and are not productive. We go through the motions of doing so many things as if there is no alternative way of spending our days. It is like being addicted, only it is not to drugs or alcohol, but to tasks, to work, to doing. Any sense of rhythm in our daily, weekly, and yearly lives has been swallowed up by the blizzard of our lives. And so, again, you're not going to stop saying yes to the wrong things just because the year changed. You're not going to stop saying yes to the wrong things just because you hear this one sermon, right? It's something more that has to happen. And that's the real truth that Jesus wants to reveal to Martha and to us. Because he continues in his response, and he says this to her complaint. But few things are needed, indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. And he says Mary has made the better choice, and that in the Greek it means the better portion, right? You think like there's this portion, but Mary's chosen the better portion, and it's not going to be taken away from her. But here's the real kicker from all this. When Jesus says Mary has made the better choice, what he reveals to Martha is you are making a choice also. And that's the thing with obligation. You feel like you don't have a choice, right? Like, I don't have a choice. But Jesus is showing, like, actually, you do have a choice. And here's the thing about obligation. It's a choice. It's often the easier choice. It is easier to keep people happy and keep up appearances and keep everything from falling apart. That's way easier than what Mary chooses, because Mary's choice is risky. It's risky because she's not doing anything she's supposed to be doing. In this day and age, the realms of men and women are highly divided. Even in the household, they're divided. And the only time women crossed into men's realm was to serve them and then to leave, right? Instead, Mary's just hanging out. And what is she doing? She's not just hanging out. She is sitting at Jesus' feet. This is the posture of a disciple, right? So Mary has put herself at she's made herself equal with Jesus' other disciples who are men. And she's sitting there, and she's taken on the posture of someone who is learning from Jesus. This is an audacious move, right? And you think Martha's complaining, and I'm like, she's not doing what she's supposed to do. And this is like, if Jesus was going to tell her to get back in her lane, this is the moment, right? Like, women, know your place. What does he do? He affirms Mary's choice. And you see this over and over again. Jesus, he defies all of these roles and stereotypes and boxes that we put one another in. And this is a big one, where Jesus affirms Mary's decision to take on the posture of an equal and a disciple. And that's pretty radical in this moment. And so Mary could have given into those same three influences very easily, right? Guilt. Look at Martha. I mean, Martha is clearly like, she's not just like doing all the work. She's one of those people who's like sighing as she does it, like, giving the sign like, hello, I'm the only one doing this, like washing the dishes, making sure that everybody knows that she's washing the dishes alone, right? And so she could have given into that guilt to be like, Martha really needs me to help her out over there. And then the fear of like, well, what is everyone going to think of me? What are the assumptions that they're going to make that I'm sitting here while Martha's doing all the work? And so there's that fear. And then the pride of like, and Martha can't really do it without me anyways. I mean, look she's clearly struggling. I'm so essential in making sure that this thing happens. But instead of being pulled away and dragged around by obligation, she draws near to Jesus. And that's the difference between the two. Martha is pulled away from Jesus by obligation. And Mary draws near to Jesus and is able to resist the pull of obligation. And that's the only way that we can do it. Jesus says there's only one thing that's essential. And what he shows Martha is you can't really serve Jesus without first listening to Jesus. You doing work for Jesus without actually sitting at his feet and learning who he is and what he is like and what it means to live the way that he wants you to live. It's just this empty effort. Jesus says there's one thing that is essential, and it shall not be taken from her. And that same choice, it's available to us too. It's available to us right now. Choosing the better way, choosing the better portion, it is not the easier way. It is not the easier way, right? Because someone is probably going to misunderstand what you do. Someone is probably going to judge what you do. Someone might reject you for what you do. Someone might write a story about you, right? Something might actually fall apart, literally fall apart because you don't continue to prop it up. It's a riskier choice to sit at the feet of Jesus first. But that's the way that we serve Jesus. Martha, again, what she was doing wasn't bad. She wasn't doing bad things. Making a meal, helping someone feel welcome, these are good. She was missing out. She was missing out on the best thing. And that's part of the irritation that she feels. Is she looks at Mary sitting at Jesus' feet and thinks, well, I'd like to do that too, but I have to. Someone has to fill in the blank, right? And often when we are irritated with other people, we think, well, it'd be nice if I could, but I can't do that. I have to do this. Because obligation makes us feel like we don't have a choice. But you do have a choice. And the only way to resist that pull of obligation is to sit at the feet of Jesus first. And I know that's what started to turn things around for me. So I couldn't change what happened at the conference. That just was bad, right? That went sideways. The talk was good. The one talk that I did was good. But afterwards, I was like, oh, that wasn't right. But I knew things had to change because I was overwhelmed at work and I was just feeling rushed and hurried and busy and I was making these rash decisions that didn't make sense. Like if I had stepped back, I would have been like, that's not the right choice. And so with this team, it became really clear. The more I started to devote time to just spend time with Jesus, I started carving out time in my schedule because I've known, I teach on this, like I've known that that's the first thing that I have to do. That's the starting place. And I just let life kind of drag me around, pull me away from what I needed to do. And so I had to come back to the feet of Jesus to resist the pull of obligation. And the more I started to pray about this team, the more it became really clear, like I needed to quit this team. Like this was the wrong team for me. Even if they thought I was the right person for the team, this was not the right yes. And so I had to call up this person who I cared very much about and respected a great deal and tell him like, hey, I this isn't the right fit. I'm so sorry. Like, this is not the right team for me. Can we figure out the best way for me to withdraw from this team? Like, how can we set an end date? And he, of course, was so disappointed, and he was telling me how great I am and how much he'd like me to stay and how important it is. But he respected me if I really wanted to stick with that decision. So I had all that pull, right, of like, oh man, there's the guilt and there's the fear and there's the pride. Like, I really am important to this team. But because I'd been spending time with Jesus, I could resist that pull, knowing like this is not bringing out the best in me. And so as we started to talk, we realized there's one big event coming up, so I would stay on through the team to help that event get done, and then after that I would roll off the team. And that's what happened. And it took a hit to my own pride, to have to say like I can't hack it. I can't do it. And so I can tell you that through that experience, I had to reset myself and realize like I get out of whack if I'm not sitting with Jesus first. And life just starts to snowball. And then all these things that come my way, I start to be like, oh, I should say yes to that, and I should say yes to that because I'm important, or that person might be disappointed, or they might think something bad about me. And it's easy for life to get out of control. But that's not how we're designed. And John Ortberg says this. It says, God designed us that our choices, our thoughts and desires, and our behavior would be in perfect harmony with each other and would be powered by an unbroken connection with God, in perfect harmony with him, with all of his creation. That is a well-ordered soul. Love that phrase, a well-ordered soul. Some of you are like, oh, I need a well-ordered soul. My soul feels like it's in disarray right now, right? And so you will not stop saying yes to the wrong things in your own strength. You will not stop saying yes to the wrong things in your own strength. It is really hard. It is really hard to make the riskier decision to sit at the feet of Jesus first and allow Jesus to dictate what we say yes and no to, because again, when you do that, other people will be disappointed. Other people may make judgments about you. Other things that you thought were so essential, they may have to go by the wayside. But saying yes to the wrong things means that you're missing out on the best things, the right things that God has for you. But you can't hear those if you're so busy rushing around. So how do we get a well-ordered soul? How do we be good quitters in 2022? Like, what if that's your resolution? I'm going to be a good quitter, not just a quitter, right? Because a quitter, you don't want to just quit. But a good quitter. What does that mean to end things well, to say yes to the right things? And so I see three things that we can do. The first is to stop and sit. To stop and sit. And I know that can sound cliche, but Jesus says there's only one thing. There's only one thing. Spend time with Jesus, right? That's the most important thing. If you choose any decision, that's a decision to make, right? And I know, like, for me, when I started getting time with Jesus, it became really clear to quit that team, right? And I was able to quit that team well and remain all those relationships and all that. But the truth is, if I had been spending time with Jesus before then, it would have been better for me to say no in the first place, right? And so some of you, this is the start of a new year, and you've got all sorts of things that people are going to ask you to say yes to, right? And yes, you can quit things well, but it's way better to just not get into something that's the wrong thing in the first place. It's easier to disappoint on the front end than disappoint halfway through, right? And so taking that time to stop and sit and actually be with Jesus and spend time with Jesus, because otherwise we get pulled away. And again, John Ortberg says this: being hurried is an inner condition, a condition of the soul. It means to be so preoccupied with myself and my life that I am unable to be fully present with God, with myself, and with other people. I'm unable to occupy this present moment. Busyness migrates to hurry when we let it squeeze God out of our lives. I cannot live in the kingdom of God with a hurried soul. I cannot rest in God with a hurried soul. And so Martha, she's got this hurried soul that leaves her with a troubled heart. And Mary makes the riskier choice of defying all the expectations to sit at the feet of Jesus first. She makes the best choice, the thing that will not be taken from her. And so to spend time with Jesus first means to make it a priority, means to make it a first thing, not a thing that you fit in in your schedule, right? And so it's building it in to your daily schedule on the front end and scheduling that time ahead of time to give God your best time. If you're a morning person, give God time in the morning. If you're an evening person, give God time in the evening. If you're a midday person, lunchtime, whatever that is, find your best time. I know for me, I'm a morning person. So if I try to fit it in at the end of the night, it's not going to happen, right? I'm going to fall asleep. This is not going to work. So I have to do it first thing in the morning. And so give God your best time. Read the Gospels. And if you're not a reader, listen to the Gospels while you walk, while you drive, whatever that is. But allow the teachings of Jesus to infiltrate your life. Make time in your weekly schedule to spend time with him. Find those abiding moments in your life. To be a disciple means to be a learner, someone who sits at the feet of Jesus. And I know for myself, I have been very disciplined with this. After that, that was not the first time I had to learn that lesson, but it was one of the last times that I had to learn that lesson because it just felt like a crash and burn, right? And so I've been really devoted to be if I take my days off, I take my time in the morning. I try to take it as seriously as I can. And I know when I get that out of whack. And I remember there was one season at this same church, and it was during Christmas time, and Christmas time can get crazy at churches. And, everyone was running around being crazy. And I was like, I'm not going to be available this morning. I had ordered my work to get it done so I could take my day off. And someone who I worked with turned to me and said, must be nice. And I said, it is very nice. And you too can have that in your life, right? And so, I resisted the guilt. I could have stepped in and helped him with his work, right? And his problem, the fear of he's Meredith is so self-absorbed or lazy or whatever that is that she's going to take time off when all of us are working like crazy people, and the pride of oh, they really, really need me. And instead, I had that, what Jesus said to Martha in my head, this is the better choice and it will not be taken from you. If you make the better choice, it won't be taken from you, and God will meet you there. And so the first way to be a good quitter is to stop and sit at the feet of Jesus. And then stop and ask. And again, obligation makes you feel like you don't have a choice. I have to do this. I have to do what everybody wants me to do. I have to show up here, and so but we are choosing. We're choosing out of guilt, fear, and pride. And so one way to stop that is to stop and ask two of the most important questions you can ask around anything. And if you've been through Kairos, you know these questions, right? And some of you are like, oh, shoot, I needed to be reminded of these questions. The first question is, do I have to? Do I have to? And the reality is, most of the time, the answer is no. You don't have to. There's no one sticking you up. You're not going to get a fine, if you don't go to this game or show up at this party. You don't have to. And so when we stop and say, do I have to do this? And we realize the answer is no, then we get to ask, do I want to do this? Do I want to do this? Do I get to do this, right? Do I get to be part of what it is? So, you don't have to go to your family gatherings. You don't have to take on a work project. You don't have to volunteer for a committee. You don't have to do any of those things. You can do those things. You can get to do those things. But we want to move into get to versus have to, because have to feels like I don't have a choice, but you do have a choice. It might be a risky choice, but you do have a choice. And the second question then, because sometimes the answer is yes, I do have to. Yes, I have to feed my children. Yes, I do have to work. Yes, I have to get dressed and be a responsible human being. Yes, I have to do those things, right? But then the other question then to ask is, do I have to do it this way? Do I have to do it this way? The way that just because someone expects me to do it this way doesn't mean I have to. Do I have to go to every single family gathering? I mean, some of you are so busy with family gatherings, you don't have any friends because you're like, I'm sorry, every weekend and every weeknight is just filled up with family dinners. And you're like, great, you don't have to be at all of those. You might disappoint someone that you don't show up, but you don't have to, right? Or parents, hey, parents, I'm looking at you right now. I know your kids are in sports. I know that you all think that they're going to be the next college great athlete and get a scholarship. Awesome. So you think I have to go to every game. I have to, because otherwise they're going to remember that one game that I wasn't at, and then I've ruined their childhood. You don't have to go to every game. Try this instead. You have to. You have to go to some games, right? Be a good parent. Ask them what games are the most important out of all. Look at their schedule with them, and they'll point it out to you. They don't need you at every game. Sometimes they don't want you at every game. Let's be honest. Kids, right? You're like, man, my parents get out of control sometimes. You're more invested than they are. And they're like, stop it, you're embarrassing me, right? You're not on the team, parents. If you're not playing on the field, you're not on the team, right? So you don't have to go to every game. Work with your kids to figure out what feels important to them? You know, what games would you like me to be at? And those are the games that I will make it a priority. But I can't commit to being at every single game. You know, that you don't have to do that. You don't have to do it that way. You know, when it comes to your work schedule, I mean, this last 2 years, right, the pandemic has really shown, like, you probably don't have to work the way that you've always been working. You don't have to do it that way. And so you can start to figure out, like, what does work for me? What does work for my schedule? And if this is a job that doesn't allow any flexibility, do I want to keep doing this job? If I don't want to keep doing this job, maybe I get to start to think about what else I want to do with my time in my life, right? You don't always have to do it that way. Holidays. You know, again, we just got through Christmas and New Year's, right? And Thanksgiving and all that. So you got a little bit of a break. I don't know. Maybe you guys are like big on Valentine's Day. Like we have a big family potluck for Valentine's Day. But you got a little break. And if you found yourself running ragged, or you traveled when you didn't want to travel, or you didn't have any time to just sit down and relax or enjoy your immediate family or whatever that was that you wanted to do, you get to set your own boundaries. You get to do that. You get to say yes and no to those things. And it might be risky, but running yourself ragged and being obligated isn't blessing other people. It's really not, even if they think that it is, right? You don't have to keep saying yes to the wrong things. You don't have to live your life at that pace. You know, God isn't necessarily asking that of you. And if you step back and start with stop and sit, he might help you sort out where can you show up with a genuine heart, with a grateful heart, where you're loving and not resentful, right? And so the last one is to stop and go, And what I mean by this is do what needs to be done, right? If you are discerning that, hey, I said yes to the wrong thing, or I need to have a hard conversation with this person and clarify expectations, or I need to set a boundary, or I need to quit something. Like I've been part of something and it's terrible, and I need to go and talk to them and say, this is not right. Let's figure out how to best roll me off of this thing. Like what's a good end date? Do that. Stop and go. Go do what needs to be done. If you don't do it, it's not going to happen, right? Like God will change your heart. God will transform you, but it requires your participation, right? So you praying and being like, God, I pray that team would willingly ask me to not be on it anymore so I don't have to have a hard conversation. God might answer that prayer for you, but he hasn't answered those for me, and I have prayed those where I'm like, maybe you could just make them have it be their idea, because I don't like uncomfortable conversations. I hate conflict. It's the worst, right? But I don't want to disappoint people or have someone think something bad about me. But the reality is, if you sense that God is telling you you've said yes to the wrong things and you've overwhelmed yourself, right, then you have to be able to cut some of those things in order to make time to allow God to show you what is the right thing to say yes to. What is the right thing? You know, and sometimes listening to Jesus means that others won't get it. Others won't understand it. Others won't like it. Others won't like you. That's going to happen. I mean, look at Jesus. Not everybody liked him, right? I think he's pretty likable, but not everybody liked him. And so looking like Jesus means that not everybody's going to like you or understand you. It's a riskier decision to follow Jesus. It's a riskier decision to sit at the feet of Jesus. And here's the thing. Obligation is not going anywhere, right? Like, it's not going to check out in 2022. Obligation is here to stay. There's always going to be someone who says, you would be perfect for, or I would love you to do this for me, or you would really make this thing work. There's always going to be an opportunity, right? There's always obligation. And obligation, if you give into it, will pull you away and leave you feeling dragged around, right? Dragged around in your own life. And the only way to resist the pull of obligation is to sit at the feet of Jesus first. And so if you're going to make any resolution this year, anything that you're going to say, I'm going to change this, the first thing to change is to say, I'm going to make it a priority to spend time with Jesus on a regular daily basis and allow him to sort out what I say yes to and what I say no to. And that will make you a good quitter, okay? So let's pray. Gracious God, thank you for this time. Thank you for helping me get through the sermon and keeping my voice together. I pray, Lord, for those today who are feeling burdened, for those who are feeling resentful or anxious, who are recognizing that they've been making decisions out of fear and worry and pride and guilt. And I pray that you would give them the courage to hear you first, Lord, that you would give them the courage to choose to sit at your feet first, Lord, and make the risky decision, because obligation, it can be easier to keep people happy and keep up appearances and keep everything from falling apart, God, but it's not always best. And help us to choose the better portion. Help us to recognize those places where we do actually have a choice and we felt like we don't. But help us to see that we do and that we would choose you and your way always. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.